All right, let's dive into some pretty heavy political theory today. We're going to be looking at an excerpt from The Leftward March, Affirmative Conservatism, and George Lincoln Rockwell.
Wow, that's quite a title.
It is. It is. And it's packed with some, well, thought-provoking ideas, to say the
I can
least.
imagine. Where do we even begin with something like that?
Well, the author kind of kicks things off by laying out this idea of what they call the leftward march of society.
Okay.
And it's interesting because they don't really consider themselves extreme or anything. They
Yeah.
see themselves as more aligned with, like a historical worldview.
Yeah, that's a pretty common thing we see. Like a lot of ideologies, kind of frame it that way.
Right.
Like, this is actually the rational way to think about things,
Exactly.
even though it might seem outside the mainstream.
Yeah, yeah. And what's fascinating here is that they connect this whole idea of a leftward march to like a rejection of objective truth
Okay.
in modern society. Hmm.
They're basically arguing that our constant, relentless pursuit of individual freedom
Mm-hmm.
has come at a cost.
Okay.
And that cost is, maybe a decline in like shared values or even
Hmm.
societal decay.
I see.
And they see this playing out in all sorts of things, rising crime rates,
Right.
breakdown in the family, that
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
thing. And then, so that's where their critique of liberalism and progressivism kind of comes in.
Okay.
They see, like all these attempts to kind of perfect society or replace traditional truths
Mm.
as actually making things worse.
Okay.
It's almost like, if you're constantly tinkering with a machine,
Yeah.
sometimes it's better to just leave it alone
Right.
if it's working, right?
You don't want to break it.
Exactly. And then they have this really striking take on how liberals respond to failure.
Oh, okay.
They basically claim that it's psychologically easier for liberals to just kind of cling to their worldview.
Mhm. Even when they're faced with, evidence that maybe contradicts it,
Yeah.
than it is to actually admit that they might be wrong.
Interesting. So it's almost like, I don't know, like doubling down on a losing bet
Yes.
because you just can't face the reality of the situation.
Exactly.
There's actually, there's some psychological backing for that idea.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there have been studies that show that, people, we tend to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs,
Right.
which is called confirmation bias.
Right.
And this can be especially strong, when those beliefs are tied to our identity or our sense of self-worth.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine, if somebody's devoted their whole life to advocating for a particular social policy,
Right.
it can be really, really hard for them to accept evidence
Yeah.
that suggests that that policy might not be working
Right.
or that it's even harmful.
Yeah. Yeah. So are you saying that like even well-intentioned people can kind of fall into this trap?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a human tendency. It's not, limited to any one political ideology or anything.
Right.
But the author seems to be suggesting that this tendency is maybe more pronounced on the left.
Okay. Interesting. And then from there, they kind of delve into the influence of Marxism,
Mm-hmm.
which they have a rather unique interpretation of.
Okay, let's hear this.
So they basically argue that Marxism actually needs capitalism to exist first,
Okay.
almost like a parasite needing a host.
Interesting.
It's this idea that capitalism creates the conditions for its own downfall
Right.
by, concentrating wealth and power
Mm-hmm.
in the hands of a few.
Okay.
And then so they see that as like a necessary first step
I see.
on the path to achieving communism, which is the ultimate goal.
Right.
And a key part of that process, according to the author, is dismantling traditional identities,
Okay.
like religion and nationalism.
Now, for somebody who maybe isn't as familiar with like Marxist theory,
Mm-hmm.
could you explain that a little bit? Like, why are those identities seen as obstacles?
Sure, yeah. So from the Marxist perspective, these identities are seen as tools of the ruling class, the what they would call the bourgeoisie.
Right.
And they're used to divide and control the working class, the proletariat.
Right.
So it's like, if workers are focused on their religious differences
Okay.
or their national pride,
Mm-hmm.
they're less likely to band together
Right.
and challenge the system that's keeping them down.
So, religion is the opiate of the masses,
Exactly.
as Marx famously said.
Yeah, it provides comfort and kind of distracts them from, the realities of exploitation.
Right.
And nationalism can be used to pit workers from different countries against each other.
Yeah.
And that prevents international solidarity.
Right. Right. Okay. That makes sense. So then the author brings up this group called the Frankfurt School.
Which was a group of intellectuals who, according to the author, kind of adapted these Marxist critiques
Hmm.
to apply to various social groups.
Okay. Yeah. And the Frankfurt School, they were definitely a pretty influential group, especially in like critical theory and cultural studies.
Right.
And they really looked at how things like the mass media, advertising, even education,
Mm-hmm.
how those systems can be used to kind of reinforce societal power structures.
Interesting.
And they argue that these systems often end up, perpetuating dominant ideologies
Mm-hmm.
and marginalizing dissenting voices.
Right, right. And the author's point is that this narrative that they created resonated so well in the West because it kind of aligned with, classical liberalism's emphasis on individual rights and equality.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like these two, seemingly opposite ideologies
Yeah.
kind of found common ground in this idea of, fighting for the underdog.
That's a fascinating point.
Yeah.
Because on the surface, liberalism and socialism.
Right. Seem like they're kind of at odds,
Yeah.
You've got liberalism with its focus on individual freedom and limited government.
Right.
And then socialism with, its emphasis on collective ownership and economic equality.
Mm-hmm.
But the author's arguing that both of them ultimately operate under this assumption of human equality.
Right, right.
And they both aim to create a more just and equitable society.
So, in a way, they're both kind of trying to achieve a similar outcome,
Yeah,
just through different means.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And then the author also suggests that our natural empathy for suffering,
Mm-hmm.
our desire to help those who are marginalized,
Right.
can actually make us more susceptible to Marxist thought,
Okay.
because we see these inequalities,
Yeah.
and we want to level the playing field.
Right, right. And they're arguing that empathy can be kind of manipulated in a way,
Exactly.
leading to policies that sound good on the surface.
But might actually undermine individual liberty or economic freedom in the long run.
Right, right. Okay. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground already.
We have.
From, the decline of objective truth
Mm-hmm.
to Marxism, the Frankfurt School.
Yeah.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But I think it's a really important foundation for understanding the rest of their argument.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's helpful to kind of, take a step back, maybe reflect on what we've discussed so far,
Yeah.
see what stands out, what questions this raises.
Good point. Good point. All right, so we'll take a quick break,
Okay.
and we'll be back in just a moment to continue our deep dive.
Sounds good. Okay, so I think we've laid a pretty solid foundation here.
Yeah, definitely.
So where do we go from here? Like, how does the author propose that we actually address all of these societal shifts that they've outlined?
Well, that's where their idea of affirmative conservatism comes in. And, it's not just about, like, reacting to what they see as the excesses of the left. It's
No.
about, like, proactively asserting a different vision
Yeah.
based on traditional values.
I see. So it's not just saying no to progressive ideas. It's about like a confident yes to something else.
Exactly.
To a different set of principles.
Yeah, yeah.
So what are some of those principles? Like how do they define these traditional values?
Well, they ground these values in what they consider to be, objective truth, which we talked about earlier.
Right.
So think of things like, the importance of family, community, faith, a strong moral compass.
Right. So it's about more than just like specific policies or laws.
Yeah.
It's about a deeper like shift in how we view the world
Right.
and our place in it.
Exactly.
It sounds like they're calling for like a cultural renewal,
Mm-hmm.
almost like a return to what they see as like the core principles of Western civilization.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And they believe that affirmative conservatism is particularly effective
Mm-hmm.
because it puts the left on the defensive.
Okay.
Instead of having to attack what conservatives are against,
Right.
they're forced to argue against these, deeply ingrained values and traditions.
You could almost think of it like a judo move or something.
Yeah,
Like instead of meeting force with force, you're using your opponent's momentum against them.
right.
Interesting.
But then the author doesn't stop there.
Okay.
They actually introduce this this really controversial figure
Okay.
into the mix.
All right.
George Lincoln Rockwell,
Oh, wow.
the leader of the American Nazi Party.
Yeah, that's definitely a turn I wasn't expecting.
Right. It's like, whoa, where did that come from?
Yeah, why bring in someone like Rockwell? Like, what purpose does he serve in their argument?
Well, the author acknowledges that Rockwell's views are, extreme, and that a lot of his actions were, reprehensible.
Of course.
But they argue that we need to kind of look beyond the surface,
Yeah.
beyond like the hateful rhetoric,
Mm-hmm.
and try to understand the underlying motivations.
I see. So they're not condoning his beliefs,
No, not at all.
but they're trying to like analyze them
Right.
within a broader context.
Exactly. They're trying to kind of place him within this historical and ideological context.
Interesting.
So they present Rockwell as someone who understood the kind of spiritual nature of the fight
Mm-hmm.
for American values.
Okay.
Especially in the 1960s, which was
Right. A very tumultuous time.
a time of immense social upheaval.
Yeah. You had the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War.
Exactly.
Like a lot of people felt like the very fabric of American society was unraveling.
Right.
And so the author is suggesting that Rockwell, in his own, twisted way,
Mm-hmm.
was trying to hold on to that,
Mm.
to preserve what he saw as the essence of American identity.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they point to his use of the swastika,
Right.
which, obviously a symbol of hate and oppression in the context of Nazi Germany.
Of course. Yeah.
But Rockwell reinterpreted it as a symbol of protection.
Mm.
A barrier against what he saw as these threats to the American way of life.
It's a very provocative interpretation.
It is.
And it's important to remember that, the vast majority of Americans, even those who maybe shared some of Rockwell's anxieties about social change,
Right.
rejected his extremist views and tactics.
Absolutely.
But the author's trying to kind of dig deeper into these psychological and cultural forces at play
Mhm.
during that era.
Okay.
And they argue that Rockwell, despite his abhorrent beliefs,
Right.
he tapped into this deep well of fear and resentment that was brewing beneath the surface of American society.
That's a really interesting point.
And they suggest that understanding those underlying emotions, those
Mhm.
anxieties about, loss of identity,
Right.
cultural erosion,
Yeah.
that's really key to understanding the broader appeal of these movements
Yeah. Okay.
that seek to restore a sense of order and tradition,
Mm-hmm.
even through, sometimes extreme measures.
Right. Right.
So it's a complex argument.
It is.
And it's important to approach it, with a critical eye,
of course.
recognizing the dangers of, normalizing or
Yeah.
sanitizing these extremist ideologies.
Absolutely.
But the author, they don't shy away from those complexities.
Yeah. And in fact, they go on to actually critique affirmative conservatism itself.
Right, which I find really interesting.
Right.
It's not just a straightforward polemic. It's
Right.
a genuine attempt to grapple with these challenges of navigating social change
Mhm.
and preserving what they see as essential values.
Okay. So what are some of the criticisms that they raise about affirmative conservatism?
Well, they acknowledge that it can be effective in the short term
Okay.
in terms of, mobilizing a base and
Yeah.
pushing back against progressive agendas.
Mm-hmm.
But they argue that it's ultimately insufficient
Okay.
for creating lasting societal change.
Why is that? What's missing from their perspective?
Well, they argue that true change requires more than just, political power
Okay.
or even cultural influence. It
Mhm.
requires a genuine embrace of those traditional values by the people,
Oh, I see.
not just enforcement by the state.
Okay.
They use the example of Francoist Spain,
Mm-hmm.
which, despite being a fascist regime,
Right.
eventually adopted many, many socialist policies.
Mm-hmm.
So even if affirmative conservatism wins politically,
Yeah.
it doesn't guarantee that those values will actually take root.
It's like trying to force a plant to grow by building a cage around it.
Yeah.
You might control its outward appearance,
Right.
but you can't force it to thrive.
Exactly.
True growth requires, the right conditions, the right nourishment.
Yeah.
And in the case of society, that nourishment comes from this shared sense of meaning,
Right.
purpose, belonging.
Exactly.
And the author seems to be suggesting that affirmative conservatism
Mm-hmm.
while it might offer a temporary solution,
Yeah.
it doesn't really fully address that deeper need.
Right, right.
They
Oh,
they argue that it can even backfire,
okay.
leading to a kind of like performative traditionalism
Mm,
that lacks genuine depth or conviction.
I see.
Like people might go through the motions,
Right.
but their hearts aren't really in it.
Yeah.
So where does that leave us then?
Right.
If affirmative conservatism isn't the answer, what is?
Yeah, what's the alternative?
Well, that's where the author's final and perhaps most controversial point comes in.
Okay.
They acknowledge the appeal of fascism, particularly in its ability to provide a strong, decisive response
Right.
to
Right.
what they see as the chaos and decadence of modern society.
Okay.
But ultimately, they advocate for a different path,
Oh, all right.
one rooted in.
Whoa. Okay, I gotta admit, I did not see that coming.
Yeah.
They acknowledge the appeal of fascism,
Yeah, it is a pretty bold statement.
especially given everything we've talked about.
Right. It really speaks to the depth of their analysis, I think. You
Yeah.
know, they're not shying away from the tough stuff.
Right.
They really try to grapple with these complex issues,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they see the appeal, of a strong, centralized authority
Mm-hmm.
that can kind of cut through the noise and impose order on what they perceive as a very chaotic society,
Right. Right.
a decadent society.
Yeah, I can see how that might be tempting for some people,
Mhm.
especially those who, feel like their traditional values are under attack.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is a very dangerous
Yes.
path. History has shown us that time and time again.
Absolutely.
The horrors that can unfold when you have these authoritarian regimes.
Right, and the author recognizes that
Okay.
they're not advocating for fascism,
Good.
but they're trying to understand its allure.
Right.
Like why would people find this appealing?
Yeah.
And they argue that it's a symptom of this deeper societal problem,
Okay.
this yearning for meaning and purpose
Hmm.
that isn't being fulfilled by, our modern secular culture.
So if fascism isn't the answer, then what is? What's the alternative path they propose?
They advocate for a path rooted in Christian faith.
Okay.
They believe that it's only through a genuine spiritual transformation,
Hmm.
a return to these core principles of Christianity, that
Mhm.
society can truly heal and find lasting harmony.
That's really interesting. So it's not
Yeah.
just about enforcing traditional values through, laws or social pressure.
Yeah.
It's about fostering this inner transformation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They see Christianity as providing this framework
Hmm.
for understanding our place in the world,
Right.
a source of meaning and purpose
Okay.
that transcends the fleeting pleasures of modern life.
Right. Right.
They believe that it offers a path to true fulfillment,
Mm.
both individually and collectively.
It's a bold claim.
It is.
And it certainly raises questions about the role of religion in public life.
Yeah.
What about those who don't share their faith? Are
Right.
they excluded from this vision?
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
And it's something that the author doesn't really fully address.
Okay.
Their focus is really on restoring what they see as these Christian foundations of Western civilization.
Hmm.
They believe that those foundations are essential
Okay.
for creating a just and flourishing society.
So they're not necessarily calling for like a theocracy, but they're saying that these Christian values
Mhm.
are essential for a healthy society.
They see them as universally applicable,
Right.
even if they are, rooted in a specific religious tradition,
Okay.
which of course raises all sorts of, complicated questions
Right.
about faith and reason and public policy.
Yeah. Wow. There's so much to unpack here.
There is. We've gone from the decline of objective truth
Right.
to Marxism, the Frankfurt School, affirmative conservatism,
Right.
George Lincoln Rockwell.
Yeah.
Now a call for a spiritual revival.
It's been quite a journey.
It has been.
I think what really stood out to me was their attempt to grapple with the appeal of fascism.
Yeah.
It's easy to kind of dismiss those views as just, evil or irrational.
Right.
But this piece really challenged me to look deeper and try to understand those motivations,
Yeah.
the fears that might lead someone to embrace that.
It's a good reminder that even the most, abhorrent beliefs often stem from a place of need,
Right.
a desire for security, belonging, meaning.
Yeah.
And while we should never condone hate or violence,
So of course not.
Understanding those underlying needs can help us, address the root causes of extremism.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I also found their critique of affirmative conservatism to be really insightful.
Hmm.
It's a good reminder that true societal change isn't just about winning elections
Right.
or imposing values from the top down.
It's about a much deeper, more fundamental shift.
Yeah,
It's about hearts and minds changing.
exactly. And that's a much more difficult task.
It is.
It requires, dialogue,
Yeah.
building bridges.
Finding common ground,
Yeah,
even when we disagree.
right, right.
Recognizing our shared humanity,
Hmm.
even amidst those disagreements.
Yeah, yeah.
So what does all this mean for us then?
Yeah, for the everyday person just trying to make sense of the world.
Right. I think the author's argument challenges us to think critically about our own beliefs,
Mm,
our own
mm,
values.
mm.
Like, what do we hold to be true?
Right.
Where do we see this tension between individual freedom and societal well-being
Hmm.
playing out in our own lives?
Right.
How do we navigate this complex world?
It's a lot to consider.
It is, but these are questions that each of us has to grapple with,
Yeah,
regardless of our political leanings.
I agree.
And I think this deep dive has given us at least a starting point,
Hmm.
a framework for approaching those questions,
Right. Yeah.
a new set of lenses to view the world through.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And maybe in the process of asking those questions,
Yeah.
we discover a little bit more about ourselves too.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us on this depth dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a challenging one,
It has.
thought-provoking,
For sure.
but ultimately, I think, a very enriching experience.
I agree.
And we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas.
Yeah.
Engage in dialogue with people who hold different perspectives
Mm-hmm.
and never stop seeking truth,
Absolutely.
wherever it may lead.